Hello again. I'm Dr. Ron Traylor, and this is History 321, and this is video number 13. And we are still talking about Reconstruction in Louisiana in the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War. Now, remember that there are fundamentally only three groups of people who have the right to vote in Louisiana in the years immediately after the Civil War ends. And those are the scalawags, the carpetbaggers, and the freedmen. Now, and due to white disfranchisement, that's a fancy word that means you lose the right to vote. Franchise is the vote, and disfranchise means you don't have the vote. All right. Um, most whites in Louisiana were members of the Democratic Party, and most whites in Louisiana had supported, in one way or another, the Confederacy. And the result is that it only leaves people who are Republicans, the scalawags, the carpetbaggers, and the freedmen. Now, a number of black men rose to political prominence in Louisiana during Reconstruction. And let me give you just a few names. One man, his name was Oscar Dunn, Dunn. Oscar Dunn had been born a slave. He had purchased his own freedom. Here a while back, we talked about how that was possible. Well, Oscar Dunn, now you're being introduced to somebody by name who actually did that, he bought himself. Oscar Dunn served as lieutenant governor of the state of Louisiana for 3 years between 1868 and 1871. Um, One of the Republican governors of Louisiana was a crook, and he was impeached and removed from office. His name, by the way, was Henry Warmoth, Warmoth. And of course, when Governor Warmoth was removed from office, when he was found guilty in the impeachment trial, his lieutenant governor becomes the governor of Louisiana. And as it turns out, that lieutenant governor is a black man by the name of P.B.S. Pinchback. Pinchback. P.B.S. Pinchback was governor of Louisiana for 5 weeks before the inauguration of the incoming governor. And this happens in 1870. Pinchback was the only black Southern governor in the South during Reconstruction, and even then, he only served about 5 weeks. Um, Pinchback was replaced as governor by a man by the name of William Kellogg. Now, Kellogg's lieutenant governor was a black man whose name was C.C. Antoine. Antoine. C.C. Antoine served as the lieutenant governor of the state of Louisiana under the white governor, William Kellogg. Other black state officials included William Brown, who was the superintendent of education in Louisiana. Now, those were the prominent ones, but there were many other black Louisianians who served in local and parish positions. Many were elected to those offices. Some were appointed to those offices. And to be quite honest with you, to give you a more complete story, most whites never accepted the idea of a freedman holding a public office, whether it was an appointive or an elective office. A legend comes into existence during this time, and it might be that this legend, that you have been exposed to this legend as well. And here's the legend. Blacks controlled the southern states during Reconstruction. And that is not true. Uh, I'll give an example. I'll give you a proof. You can you can go online and Google, for example, Louisiana State Legislature 1870, and there will be a picture of all of the men who served in the Louisiana legislature in 1870. Now, if if the myth was true, then most of those faces would be black, wouldn't they? But that's not the case. Most of the faces are white, some black faces. But just that simple uh, exercise will show you that blacks were never in control of state legislatures during this time. It simply never happened. Whites still controlled the political machine, even if it was even if it was a Republican political machine. Now, is it true that more blacks served than ever? Absolutely. But did they control the states? No. All right. Most of the state was devastated by the war, especially the Mississippi River region, right? Southwest and western Louisiana, and the Florida parishes. There was great loss of life and limb, and that was among soldiers who were white and black. There were thousands of cripples among the ex-soldiers after the war was over. And the reason why is that um, uh, medicine was still rather primitive uh, in many ways at that time. Today, if you were in a wreck and your leg was badly mangled, for example, yuck, right? But let's assume it was true. The chances are likely that after a number of long and lengthy and painful surgeries, medicine could save that leg. They could put pins and screws and all kinds of stuff to hold that leg together while it's healing. None of that stuff existed back then. The general solution, if you had a mangled leg or a mangled arm, you'd been hit by a big bullet or a cannonball fragment or something like that, the common solution was simply to amputate the limb. And as a result, thousands of cripples just in Louisiana. Because remember that not only did Louisianians fight in Louisiana, but many Louisianians fought in other areas of the Confederacy. Um, some of Robert E. Lee's most trusted soldiers were members of the 1st and 2nd Louisiana Brigade that were a part that they served at Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia. So Louisiana soldiers were everywhere, and everywhere they were getting killed and they were getting maimed. During Reconstruction, a substantial part of Louisiana's budget went to buying prosthetic legs and prosthetic arms for soldiers who had lost limbs through amputation. There was also economic loss. Agriculture in Louisiana, it recovered, but it recovered slowly. The land itself depreciated in value because the land was lying fallow. Nothing was being raised on the land. It was not being plowed. It was not being prepared for a crop. It was just land. And as a result, it depreciated in value. Livestock in many areas had either been eaten or destroyed by the invading armies. The fields went wild. Tools had been lost or stolen or worn out and couldn't be replaced. Farmers went bankrupt and couldn't borrow The only thing they owned was land, but they didn't have the means to, they didn't have the tools to cultivate it, and they didn't have the workers to work it. On top of all of that, in 1866 and in 1867, there were terrible floods on the Mississippi River. The levee system, which was not nearly as good as it is today, but the levee system as it was had been permitted to deteriorate during the war. There were numerous cracks and breaches in the levee, and much of Louisiana's most fertile land was under 2, 3, 4 feet of water from the 1866 and 1867 floods. I already mentioned roads were never good to begin with in Louisiana. They were already bad, and they were neglected even further during the war. The railroads had been destroyed by mostly Union cavalry. Many of the railroads that were damaged by the Union Army were not repaired and put back into use until 1870. Now, that's 5 years since the end of the war. It took that long for some of the railroads to be put back into service. Many of the steamboats that had chugged up and down Louisiana rivers and bayous and streams and lakes had been captured by the Union forces or had been sunk by Union forces. What about the banking industry? Now, that is so important to any economy. Excuse me. In 1861, there had been only 13 banks in the entire state of Louisiana to begin with, and all of them were in the city of New Orleans. By 1865, the year the war ends, only 10 of those 13 banks are left. In 1875, 10 years after the war ends, there were only 5 banks left in Louisiana, and all of them were in New Orleans. Not until the year 1880 were any new banks established outside of New Orleans. Now, one legend has grown up that people pretty much take as the true gospel, and that is that the Republican government, the Republican officials, were corrupt and self-serving. And that's true. Okay, that is true. We simply cannot deny that. It doesn't matter whether you want to deny it or not, it is true. Remember what I said? The old professor told me years ago. He said, "You're entitled to your own opinion, but you are not entitled to your own facts. A fact is a fact. Truth is truth." And many of the Republicans were, in fact, corrupt. Now, that's the first part of the legend. The second part of the legend is that when Reconstruction ends and the Republicans are removed from office, when the Democrats can now vote again, right? The Democrats are going to bring pure and spotless and honest government back to Louisiana. That is a lie. That's not just a lie, that's a big lie. The Democrats were just as crooked as the Republicans. The Democrats were equally as corrupt. They were equally as self-serving as the Republicans had been. Now, Reconstruction left behind a legacy of distrust between whites and blacks that I believe that distrust continues through today. And that is sad. What is also sad is that the end of Reconstruction saw a return to power of the same Democratic leaders who had been in charge of the state of Louisiana before and during the Civil War. You see the same names popping up again. And sometimes if you don't see a specific name, it'll be the name of their son or their nephew or something like that, right? Same families that had controlled Louisiana uh, under the Democrats returned to power in Louisiana. Okay. So Reconstruction is over in Louisiana. Louisiana has been um, redeemed. Very that's a very religious term, right? Who is the Bible talks about redemption and a redeemer. Okay, but Louisiana is now back in the Union, and so let's talk about the politics of the time, because when Louisiana returns to the Union, um, most of the, if not all, of the men who had lost their rights of citizenship regain those rights, and so now um, all the people who had lost the vote can now vote. And as I said a few moments ago, it should not surprise us that in a state that was predominantly Democratic before the Civil War, Louisiana will return to being dominated by the Democratic Party. Now, uh, the Democrats who were elected in after Reconstruction, we call them by two names. We call them some historians refer to them as bourbons, like the booze, right? Bourbon, bourbons. And some historians call them the redeemers. Now let's talk about the differences between those two terms, because both terms are, we're talking about the Democrats, right? These are two terms that are applied to the same group, Democrats. Some people call the Democrats the Bourbons because the family name, like my last name is Traylor, right? Well, the last name of the many of the French rulers uh, uh, was Bourbon. They were members of the Bourbon family, like Smith or the Jones family. They were Bourbon. And to call uh, Louisiana Southern Democrats Bourbons was really an insult, because a famous historian had said that the Bourbons, while they were in power in France all those years, they learned nothing and remembered everything, right? They learned nothing and they remembered everything. Now, there was another group of people who referred to the Democratic Party as the Redeemers, and that has a religious connotation, doesn't it? Um, and what it suggests is that whites had been saved from the United States government. Whites had been saved from Reconstruction. Now, well, no matter what you want to call them, you can call them Bourbons or you can call them Redeemers. I don't care, as long as you understand that they're talking about both terms refer to the same group. And what is the group? The Democrats. So the Democratic Party returns to power in Louisiana after the presidential election of 1876. And that would be when Reconstruction ends in the state of Louisiana. Now, who were some of these Democratic leaders? What were some of the characteristics of these Democratic leaders? Well, generally, they were white. Generally, they were Democrats. Generally, they were conservative. They didn't like change. And generally, they were men of substance. They were men of wealth. And if you were a man of wealth in Louisiana at this time, that meant that you probably were a member of one of three groups. You were either a planter, or you were some type of a businessman, or specifically, you were a merchant. Now, please do not lose track of the fact that black Louisianians, black adult males, could vote. And that was always right here, right in the front of the brain of white political leaders. Because in order to control the state of Louisiana, the Democrats had to control the black vote. And to which party did most blacks then give their loyalty? It was the Republican Party. Now, if you have joined me for any other American history classes, especially a 20th century American history class, you know that this is no surprise to you when I tell you that in the years after the Civil War, that most black Americans voted in a block vote very, very faithfully for the Republican Party. They referred to it as the party of Lincoln, and they just about worshiped Abraham Lincoln. Now, we also know as American historians that that changes in around in the 1930s. It starts in the election of 1932 and it's pretty much over by the election of 1932. 36. I'll get this right in a minute. Let me say that again. It begins in the election of presidential election of 1932 and it's pretty much over by the presidential election of 1936. At that point, and ever since then, black Americans have given their overwhelming support to the Democratic Party. So when I talk about black support for Republicans during this time period, I'm not misspeaking. It was the way it was. So you got the white Democrats and the black Republicans. And there are almost as many blacks as whites. We've talked about that already in this class. It was pretty much a 50-50 split between white and black Louisianians. And so it becomes very important for whites to get power and to keep power. They've got to control the black vote. Now, here's something that might be a surprise to you. Today, when you go vote, your vote is private. Nobody sees how you vote. No one knows how you vote unless you choose to let that be known, right? It's a secret ballot. But the secret ballot did not exist in Louisiana for most of the 19th century. When people went to the polls to vote, they stood in line until it was their turn to vote. And then they stood up and went in a clear voice, spoke, I support Mr. ABC. I support Mr. XYZ. Everybody standing around knew exactly how you had voted. The voter simply signed the roll and announced in a clear voice the names of the candidates he supported, and there was no doubt for whom each voter cast his ballot. Now, this causes a problem for black voters. Without the secret ballot, black voters must make it known who they support. Also, now, this is a very real scenario. One of the election officials or some of the people standing around listening to hearing how everybody votes, one of those persons might be let's say that this black man works in the lumber mill. And one of the election officials or one of the people standing around is the owner or the manager of the lumber mill. And he's a white guy, which means that he's almost certainly a Democrat. And a black guy comes in to vote, and he almost certainly is a Republican. And the black man in the clear voice lets everyone know who he's voted for. And if he votes for a Republican, what very well might happen to him. When he goes to work the next day at the lumber mill, he might discover that he no longer has a job. And if you are a poor black man, and of course, the vast majority of black men were in fact poor, if you were a poor black man, the loss of your job would prove to be catastrophic. There were no programs in place to help you financially. There was no social security. There was no unemployment. There was none of that stuff. Your job was your lifeline. And now you've lost your job. The freedmen were very much aware of the power that could be exerted by whites. And so many blacks were uh, they were coerced into voting against their best interest. They were coerced to voting for the Democrat. Now, does that mean that somebody literally threatened the black man with the loss of a job? Well, maybe, maybe not. But it didn't have to be done. There didn't have to be a spoken threat. It was understood that if you voted for the Republican candidate, you very well might lose everything that you had. So, white Democrats used intimidation as one, just one, because there were others, one tool to control the black vote. Another way that the black vote could be uh, controlled was through corruption. The black guy comes in and votes for the Republican candidate, but what does the election official write down? That he voted for the Democrat. And who's to prove him wrong? So, in a state that was almost 50-50 black and where all adult black men could vote, you would think that these elections would be very, very close, right? But that's not necessarily true. Quite often, the Democratic candidate, the white candidate, won by overwhelming numbers. And we here in 2020 can read into that either the black voter was intimidated or that some type of corruption was involved. Now, what were the major political issues of the day? Well, I mean, we're going to get back and talk about black voter intimidation. The black vote, or more accurately, how to deprive blacks of the vote, becomes probably political issue number one. Now, some of you have been taught that black, and let's get back to Louisiana specifically, okay? Now, what I'm saying about Louisiana is pretty much applying to all the South, but let's talk about specifically about Louisiana. You've been taught that black Louisianians had the right to vote during Reconstruction and that they lost the right to vote immediately after Reconstruction ends, and that is not true. Blacks continued to vote between 1876, that's when Reconstruction ends, and 1896. And that's an important date, but we'll talk about why it's important when we get to it, okay? But for right now, I just want you to write down that blacks continued to vote between the years 1876 and 1896, but in decreasing numbers. They did not all lose the right to vote when Reconstruction ended. Blacks continued to have a certain amount of political power in Louisiana. During Reconstruction, more than 30 black men at one time, not at one time, okay, no, not at one time, but over a period of time, 30 more than 30 black men served in the Louisiana State Senate. More than 100 black men served in the Louisiana State House of Representatives. And as I mentioned before, many more served. Excuse me. That just sometimes comes out of nowhere. We also said that many more were either elected to state to parish and local offices, and others were appointed to parish and local. I'm not going to start this video over again because I'm having a sneezing fit. All I can do is offer to you my apologies. Keep going. Now, I talked about the importance of the year 1896. Let's talk about that now. My. Most most of the freedmen, most adult male freedmen were farmers. It's what they had done while they were slaves. I hope that's not too loud to your ears. They were farmers, and they were good farmers. I mean, blacks had been farmers since the first blacks arrived in Virginia in 1619. What did black Louisianians want after Reconstruction ends? Well, the answer is easy. They wanted the same things that whites had. They wanted their freedom. They wanted to be able to worship the way they wanted to worship. We've talked about that. They wanted the right to educate their children. We've talked about that. And as much as anything else, they wanted the right to provide for themselves economically. And the only way they could do that was to own land. Now, the length of this video is going to be shortened because I'm sneezing and snorting and drinking water. And are you getting tired yet of me saying, I'm sorry, I apologize? Immediately after the Civil War, in certain places, especially over in the Carolinas and in Georgia, Union generals began to divide up plantations that were owned by whites, and they began to give land to the slaves who had actually worked on those plantations previously. And generally, what they would do, the larger the slave family, the more land that the slave father would receive from the Union general. And that's where the term 40 acres and a mule comes from, all right? The average size of one of these farms was 40 acres, and that's what you needed to get started farming. You needed land and you needed something to plow with, 40 acres and a mule. The problem is that property ownership is one of the most precious rights of Americans. And this goes back to the days of when the Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson. What did Jefferson originally, in his rough draft of the Declaration, what did Jefferson say? We hold these truths to be self-evident. And he's talked about the rights that are given by God. And he said, among these are what? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the way it is today. But what did the rough draft say? Life, liberty, and he was convinced to change that property to the pursuit of happiness. But that shows us how important property ownership is in America. Jefferson himself said that he would like to see all Americans be farmers, be small farmers, to raise enough crops to feed the farmer and his family, and maybe a little bit extra to sell for cash so he could buy the things that he could not produce for himself. So, this idea of the sanctity of personal property goes really deep into American soil. Now, why did I tell that whole story? Well, when Abraham Lincoln heard that his generals were starting to divide up some of these plantations in the South, he stopped those generals from doing that, and he forced them to give that land back to the guy who had originally owned the land, take it away from the freedmen. And when the Civil War ended, this principle that land ownership was almost a religious thing had been reconfirmed across the United States. And so I say, as a historian, especially as a Southern historian who teaches Southern history, I say that the United States missed a wonderful opportunity to do away with a lot of the antagonism between white and black that existed then and which still exists today if the federal government would have supported the division of these southern plantations into smaller plots and given those plots to the freedmen. Remember, the Southerners didn't force Lincoln to give the land back. That was Lincoln's decision. By that time in the war, Southerners were pretty much helpless. And they would not have been able to really raise much of a opposition if the federal government had taken that opportunity to divide that private property up among the people and give it to the people who had been making huge profits for their for the white property owners for generations. It didn't happen. Okay, let's play what if history. That's fun, right? What if there had been some sort of land redistribution in at the very end of the American Civil War? What would have happened? We think we can't know because we're playing what if history, right? But we think what would have happened is that it would have created right there a strong black middle class of property owners who were no longer dependent on the white guy. These independent property owners could have made the decisions about what they were going to raise, uh, but those decisions were taken away from them because there was no land redistribution. Now, let's go forward in time a little bit. Now, we're finished playing what if. We're back to reality. It was the desire of just about every black man to own his own piece of land. But after the Civil War, especially after Reconstruction ends, many white property owners across the South, they band together and now I'm not a big conspiracy theory guy, okay? But this is no conspiracy. We know that this happened. White Southern property owners got together and they conspired with each other to deny selling land, to prevent selling land to black farmers. Now, there were 4 million blacks in America at the end of the American Civil War, and the vast majority of them lived in the South. So, and all they, except for the few house slaves, the few blacksmiths, the few carriage drivers, we've been through that, right? Because we know that not all slaves were field hands, but we also know that most of them were. Most of the freedmen knew one thing, and that was farming, and they were really good at it. They'd been doing it a long time. And what they wanted was their own private land upon which to farm, but that was being denied them. So, what was the next best thing? It was this thing called sharecropping. How did sharecropping work? Well, there was the way that it was supposed to work, and there was the way that it actually worked. So let's talk first about the way it should have worked. Okay. The freedman goes to the property owner and says, I would like to enter into a contract with you to farm some of your land. And of course, the property owner is desperate for workers on his land. And so he says, yeah, let's talk about it. So they draw up a contract. It might be written, it might be oral, but nevertheless, it's a contract. And in the contract, they decide how many acres the farmer will get to farm. Generally, the bigger the family, the bigger the farm, right? So they decide on how big the farm was going to be. Then they would decide on uh, how the profits would be divided up. The more that the freedman could bring to the table, the more he would make from the crop. For example, if he already had a mule, if he already had a plow, if he already had some shovels, right, then he would get more of the value of the crop. If the white guy had to provide those things for the freedman, then the freedman would get less of the crop. So they would decide on the split, right? Is it going to be 50-50, 60-40, 70-30, whatever. Then the property owner would accompany the freedman down to the local general store and would help the freedman establish a credit account. Because remember, the freedman doesn't have 10 cents in his pocket. He doesn't have any money to buy seed or to buy food, for that matter, until the crop comes in. And so the property owner helps the freedman establish a line of credit at the local uh, general store. And at that point, the freedman goes to work and he starts to put in his crop. He works the crop. He and his family work the crop until it's harvest time. When it's harvest time, the cotton or the corn, or probably cotton, cotton is picked and it's baled and it's brought into town. It's weighed, and a value is assessed. You know, you got 1,000 pounds of cotton at 5 cents a pound, right? So he gets paid 1,000 pounds, 5 cents a pound. He gets paid for that. Now, at that point, what does the freedman do? He pays the property owner his share of the profit, right? He pays the property owner his share of the profit, and he puts the rest of it in his pocket. That's called the freedman's profit. Then the freedman turns right around and goes to the general store and pays off his debt there. And whatever's left off there, he keeps, right? That is fundamentally capitalism in action. And that's the way that sharecropping was supposed to work. How did it actually work? Well, Some of it stayed the same, but some of it changed radically. The freedman and the property owner would still get together and they would still decide how big the property was going to be. And then, the property owner quite often would still, and the split would still be based on the tools and the assets and the resources that the freedman brought to the table. The property owner would still help establish a relationship between the freedman and the merchant. But at that point, things start to fall apart because the merchant generally was a crook. Now, if any of you can track your family story, any of my white students, if you can track your your family tree back to a great 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 grandfather or whatever who owned a general store in a meat, right? The chances are likely, I'm sorry to say, is your grandfather was a crook because they took advantage of the sharecroppers. For one thing, they they had a two-tier, that's TIER, a two-tier, a two-layer credit system. If you wanted a pricing system, if you wanted to pay cash for an item, they would charge you, let's say they would charge you 50 cents for an item. But if you were going to put it on credit, they would charge you 60. So they were making money off the sharecropper, right, to begin with. Then at the end of the year, when the crop came in, and the sharecropper came in to pay off his debt, the sharecropper was a really good farmer, but he probably knew very little about mathematics, reading, writing, arithmetic, and so it's a very good likelihood that the merchant is going to add up his debt incorrect, and he's going to overcharge him. The sharecropper might owe $100 really, but the merchant is going to say you owe me 125. And what can the sharecropper do? He doesn't really understand it. He might feel that he's being cheated, but can't prove it because he can't add and subtract. Plus, when the sharecropper took the cotton to the local gin to get it weighed, he very well might be cheated there. He might actually have 1,000 pounds, but the gin operator is going to say, well, you've only got 975. So he loses the value of that 25 pounds of cotton. The result of all of this manipulation by the whites uh, leads to problems for the sharecropper. Rather than having money left over at the end of the year after he's paid all of his debts, he probably is going to walk away even deeper in debt than when he started. And there was little he could do about it. He couldn't complain too loudly. He couldn't accuse the white merchant of being a crook too loud because he might be punished. I mean, the Klan might come and burn his house down or something. Now, let me tell you something that you might not know. There were more white sharecroppers than there were black sharecroppers. Let me say it in a different way. Not all sharecroppers were black. Uh, there were many more whites in the South than there were blacks, and so mathematics will prove to you that therefore there were probably more. Not probably. There certainly were more poor blacks. I'm sorry. There certainly were more poor whites than there were poor blacks, and many whites were forced to sharecropping, just like blacks. The only difference is that they were not refused the right, the opportunity to own land. They simply couldn't afford it to begin with. They were forced to become sharecroppers. But a white sharecropper had an advantage over the black sharecropper. think about this very carefully. The white sharecropper would go through the entire process that the black sharecropper does. That's true. But when harvest time came, the white guy, if he felt that he was being cheated, he could speak up without endangering himself or his family. He could, for example, say, "Look, I'm not sure that that count is right. I really think that I've got 1,000 pounds of cotton there, not 975. Why don't we let a neutral third party look at the scale?" And so they would call the minister of the local First Baptist church, right? The white guy goes to that church. He's known by the pastor, and they reweigh the bale of cotton, and the white pastor says, "Oh yeah, it's 1,000 pounds," right? And at that point, everything's cool. But the black guy does not have anyone to appeal to. He's by himself. As a result, now, very few white sharecroppers ever got rich, but they at least survived. Black sharecroppers went further and further and deeper into debt. What would happen? He would go in and weigh the cotton, and the merchant would say it's 975. He was cheating the black sharecropper. And then the merchant would say something that was extraordinarily hypocritical. He would say, he would he would speak to the black sharecropper. He would say, "Bill, uh, I know you well. Uh, uh, I knew you back when you were a slave to my uncle or something, right? And I know that you're a good man. You're a good Christian man. And Bill, I just can't explain to you how bad I feel that your cotton crop didn't cover your debt this year. But Bill, he will say, because I know you're a good man. Maybe next year's crop will be better. Maybe next year's crop will be a bumper crop. And so, what I'm going to do, Bill, I'm going to carry the leftover of this year's debt. I'm going to carry it on the books. I'm going to carry it forward, and I'm going to keep giving you credit. And then maybe next year will be the year when you can pay off all of the debt, not just this year's remainder, but the debt from next year as well. Well, it never, hardly ever worked out like that. The black sharecropper every year kept getting deeper, deeper, deeper into debt. It was a spiral of debt. And that debt affects the black family in ways that we don't think about unless it's brought to our attention. For example, one of the things that the freedmen wanted was to get their wives and children out of the cotton fields. The white wives and the white children were not expected to go out and plant or pick or hoe or chop cotton. They wanted they didn't want anything more than the whites had, but they wanted what the whites had. They wanted the same rights and the same privileges, and they wanted to make sure that their wives became housekeepers and their children were in school, just like the white wife and just like the white children. But when the debt kept piling up, many of the black sharecroppers were forced by circumstances to pull their kids out of school and put their kids and their wives into the fields to try to increase the size of the crop. Now, that's a noble goal, isn't it? Be debt free. But by pulling the kids out of school in order to put them into the fields, what did that almost guarantee? It guaranteed ignorance. Now, before you get all upset at Dr. Traylor for talking about ignorant people, you need to understand what the definition of ignorant is. I didn't say that these people were stupid. Stupid means you can't learn. Ignorant, that means that you have not had the opportunity to learn. I am not stupid, and neither are you. But I am ignorant in many ways, and so are you. Uh, for example, I know a lot about history, but I don't know much about physics, right? So it can be accurately said that I am ignorant when it comes to physics. I haven't learned it yet. I haven't had an opportunity to learn it yet. Okay, so there you go. I hope you're no longer upset at me for saying that this created more and more ignorance. Didn't have they had lost the opportunity to learn, and they were, as a result of that, ignorant. Entire generations of Southern black families were ignorant. They were smart. They had the capacity to learn, but they were not given the opportunity to learn. And so all of this results in increased poverty and increased ignorance. Now, in our next lecture, we will pick up this train of thought and we will develop it even further. And I hope to see you then. And until then,